Hey everyone, welcome back to the showroom today. And if you haven't already seen our car buyer's guide, which sits in our web store, you'll find some really useful hints and tips about what to look out for when you're buying your new car, whether it's something a little bit more exotic, something sporty, or something more run-of-the-mill and practical. And there's a few sort of questions that I always get, and they're normally around what to look out for, things like that. So this is a very brief guide into some really useful tips to just look out for when you're buying your next car. And it's worth keeping in mind that these tips will vary car to car, so you can't write off a car just because some of the tips might not apply. But if we're looking at the Mustang and the X5 here, so this 2009 X5 I bought knowing that it had some damage. Checked it out, it was actually a better car than an undamaged car, the same age, similar case, similar price, that was just clearly had a hard life. But the place to start for me is always under the bonnet. And what you're generally looking for is the latches, the hinges, just to make sure that nothing is too shiny, too new and clearly replaced. Make sure that the hinges will operate nicely, because you get a front end shunt, and it tends to be one of the things that people don't get right when they're putting a car back together. And you want to pop off the thermal and soundproofing and just have a look under the bonnet, and very quickly, if there's any repairs, you'll be able to A, feel a massive gap, and B, see any welding that had been done. Now, let's say you've done that. The next thing to check are just quickly the bolts around the car's engine bay. You want to make sure that none of them are clearly new and very shiny compared to the others. You want to make sure that they're all a original fit, and also look out for damage and bits of rust. You can see here that this bolt has clearly been undone a few times, and as a result has rusted. That's not always a sign of a crash. It is very common to pop off fenders and things like that to do jobs in the wheel well. So it's not a definitive test, but it's a good indicator. And then what you want to do is just have a look around the engine bay and check things like cross members look like they're in the right place. There's normally a few tools that I take when I'm viewing a car. And they're normally my trusty paint gauge, which tells me how thick the paint is on a car, a pry tool, a torch, and a tape measure. And I'll show you what I use each and every one of those as I run around the car. But first things first, the most obvious thing to look out for are remains of or signs of a poor repair. Now, this car was repaired in 2011, so chances are quite a thorough job was done, because the car still retailed for a good price. But what you need to look out for are things like your panel gaps. Make sure they're uniform. You can see where this one narrows here, and you get a bit of a wider gap at the top. It's a sign that a panel's probably been refitted. In the worst case, it could be a sign of some chassis damage, so it is something to look out for. And again, here you can actually see a much more uniform gap. Same goes with the back and elsewhere on the car. The fit of the panels is generally quite good. This back door, you will notice, does jut out a little bit, but I have known quite a few X5s to have that problem. And as you can see, once again, the panel gaps are quite uniform, a little bit bigger at the top, but again, it is a bit of an X5 trait. Next up, what I tend to like to look out for is the glass on the car. So straight away, you can see that this is not factory glass. And as you work your way around, you notice the side windows are factory glass. So it sort of indicates that potentially the damage was limited to the front end. It doesn't give you a reliable indicator because, of course, people do replace their front windscreens for stone chips and things like that. But coming up to the front again, another thing that you really need to look out for. Of course, like I said, you do want to check your VIN so you can do an official check. And you will tend to find in a modern car that is displayed in a window in your windscreen. And importantly, look for the hard stamped copy, which normally resides in the engine bay. On BMWs, it's around the suspension strut, on the tower, but also it could be under your passenger footwell carpet. It could be in the door jambs. Have a thorough look and make sure all your VINs match. Now, of course, there are tools to do this with a lot more detail, but if you're just out and about shopping and buying a car, a tape measure can tell you volumes. What you want to do is find a reference point on your wheel about halfway, and let's say towards the bottom of your bumper. And here you can see that there's a 7 centimeter gap. And at the top, there's about a 10 centimeter gap. And at the back, there's about let's call it a 9 centimeter gap. Now, what you want to do is go to the same axle on the other side, and you just want to repeat the process. So straight away, you can see that there is a bit of a difference there. Here, we're looking similar enough, and similar enough back here. So it does seem like there is a bit of a difference here. I do realize that my wheel isn't completely straight, which does change things, but typically that's what you've got to look out for, any extremes in differences in the gaps. I've had a Pajero which had a 10 centimeter difference in the geometry of the front wheels, which had a heavy front impact, and it's only with a little tape measure and having a look on the run that you could really pick that up. What normally comes next is I grab my trusty torch, of all things, and here's where you really want to start getting dirty and having a look under the car. With a car with a plastic bumper like this, any damage is normally evident. For cars with painted bumpers, you tend to find that if they've been patched up, the inside is all rough, and then obviously they've sanded and painted the surface with a rough repair on the inside. On a big 4x4, it's a lot easier to get under and have a look. But again, what you want to look for is any obviously new components, any new bash guards and things like that, any new arms, brakes, and of course, again, changes here aren't always necessarily hinting to an accident, but they could be. Ideally, you want to take a screwdriver and pop off these cases to see if there's any damage to the engine sump and the bottom, and also get your torch in through the grills, have a look at any supports and things that are in there. Check that the screws are consistently worn and that there isn't massive evidence of anything being completely new, which could hint at some recent crash repairs. So fairly obvious, you want to check out the panels, check out the mechanics for any evidently new or clearly damaged componentry. Next up, we'll actually dig out the paint gauge and see what that can tell us. So my paint gauge actually connects to my phone, which is a great tool to be able to assess paint as a detailer on the move, but it also comes in very handy to identify crash damage. Let me show you what I mean. So I take my paint gauge and place it on the panel of the car, and instantly my phone will tell me the approximate measurement of the thickness of the paint between the metal and the device. And as you work your way around the car, you should start to find that things are quite consistent. However, where you start to see paint that is thicker, especially if it's isolated to one area, you start to realize that this is an area that has been repaired. Now, it could be something major. It could be opening a door into a lamppost. However, if you start to see a whole panel that has been replaced or resprayed or used is sort of particularly thick, I've had readings up in the 3 to 500s, then it starts to indicate that putty has been used, bog has been used, and the car has been severely patched up. So right here, we're starting to get the picture that the front end of this car has had something happen at a point in time, because the front doors have extremely thick paint. Now, in the factory, the paint is very accurately controlled. Therefore, you tend to find it does sit in anywhere up to around 165, I tend to find. Where you have something that is sitting up in the 200s, and in this case, you notice it is the two front doors. That tells me something has happened to the front end of this car, and the doors have been either replaced or resprayed as part of the repair to blend the paintwork in. Remember that not all repairs are evidence of a crash. Take this Mini, for example. We have some very heavy stone chips. Now, somebody has patched up the paint on this as best as they could because of those chips. But you can tell in these fluorescent lights as you come to a corner where the panels haven't been blended and the new paint clearly contrasts with the old. Now, if this wasn't limited simply to the bumper in this car, the bonnet, sorry, I'd have a lot of concerns. But what you can see is that the bumper is more of a match with the rest of the car, which to me just shows that this bonnet has been touched up at a point in the past, and the fact that we can see evidence of stone chips and things like that, it seems like that was more of a cosmetic choice rather than trying to hide a crash. So here I can show you some more clear evidence of crash repair that at first is hard to see, but once you know what you're looking out for, it sticks out like a sore thumb. So here you can see, and this is a customer's car, where the surface is very pitted, and that's where putty's been used and the paint hasn't quite been applied properly. And then here you can see a deep indentation, and if you go over here using the light to try and get a shallow angle, you can see more of the same. Now, all of these scratches sit below the paint, which you can tell by the way the light reflects off them. What they are sanding marks. So the car has been prepared, either patched up with bog or putty or even just primer, and then that surface has been sanded and then they've applied paint. Unless you get that sanding done perfectly and then apply the right primer, these sanding marks remain under your paintwork, and they're a telltale sign that some paintwork has been done to the car that you're looking at. And this is where you can hear variances in the way acoustically the panel sounds, and it's also where I would get the paint gauge out, because straight away here and here we will have very high readings. Another simple test is to simply shut the door and listen for any loose rattling. And furthermore, if you can get the car into an area with fluorescent lighting, like we have in here, it shows off inconsistencies in the paintwork much more readily. You may find that all factory paint has some orange peel, where the surface of the paint literally looks like an orange peel, like we have here. But what you're looking for is changes in that consistency. If one section looks particularly well finished and the rest is very rough, then it's again indicative that something may not be quite what it seems. And they've actually done a very good paint job on this car. Again, you also want to check all of the shuts to make sure that everything looks factory, looks clean, and there's no significantly dodgy welds or patches that have gone in place. If you can pop out the headlights and the tail lights and see the labeling, it's good to verify that they're factory, because then of course it's reminiscent that there's not been a problem. Whereas if you start to see aftermarket headlamps, it could be something innocent, it could be reminiscent of a crash. Again, under the rear bumper is a good place to check. You'll tend to find in a car that has been rear-ended and repaired on the cheap, you won't find any of this heat shielding, because it's easier just to put it together without it, and you'll find some very, very shocking welding or patching on the trailing edges of the car. You also might find some impact material is no longer there, it might not have been replaced. From the back, also check that you can clearly see your roll bars are undamaged in your suspension componentry. Do the measurement test in the same way, and just have a look at the struts and the mounting points of the suspension components to make sure that there's no clear bends, rust, twisting or cracking, all of which would suggest that you may need to walk away from the car.
So I hope that was of some help to you. As you can probably appreciate, it was a real short amount of time to cram a lot of information into, but I hope it's at least given you some tips on things that you can look out for when you're buying your next car. And it's worth noting again, I can't stress enough, that not all of these checks and tests are necessarily representative of a major smash. At best, they just indicate that there is something that's happened that isn't clear on the surface, and it might be something that you just need to use to negotiate with, or it could be something that you just decide you need to walk away from the deal altogether. So it's all about arming you with tools that you can use to get a better deal or avoid catastrophe. So I hope that's helped. Feel free to shoot a message if you would like the ebook, which goes into more detail about things to look out for when you're buying your next car. And remember that a car can be written off with a lot of superficial damage, just like the Porsche in the other video. So until then, happy shopping, and I'll hopefully see you all soon. Take care. Thanks for watching.